Hey, what is up, you guys? It is Blind Cat in the house with my very dear friend Stephanie. And I don't know if you recall, but Stephanie and I previously had started a discussion about fraud. We got into fraud, particularly in SCM, because SCM, like when I mean SCM, is that when you buy stuff for a company, it's like it's easy to that is an area that is often vulnerable to fraud. And so if you haven't actually listened to that particular episode, you don't necessarily have to, that's not necessarily a prerequisite for this episode, and we're just continuing on the conversation. But where we left off in that one was essentially there's only limited ways in which uh money essentially can leave an organization. Right, Stephanie?
Mhm. That's
And
correct, Kat.
yeah, and you were going to elaborate on that off the air, and I was like, wait, this is gold. Let's put this on the air and record it. So, over to you.
Well,
The floor is yours.
thanks again, Kat, for having me. So yeah, what we were all excited about, or what I was excited about, was there is limited ways to get money out of an organization. So you have your payroll processes, but it's really difficult to monkey with payroll because there's remittances to the government and there's reconciliations that occur on a regular basis. Largely because of the government requirements to ensure accuracy in the reporting. Then you have your procure to pay or your sort of supply chain functions. So these are invoices from suppliers, invoices for goods, invoices for specialty services, say maybe like legal fees or other types of fees that get processed through an organization. And this is where it can get really interesting. So these invoices, the acquisition of goods and services, is where you see a lot of fraud. And we're not talking little numbers, right? We're talking like hundreds of millions of dollars a year. In a recent study, I'm just going to pull this up for you here so I can reference it correctly for you. But the 2023 Fraud and Financial Crime Report analyzed global data from across about 400 senior leaders. And really, it sheds light on the fact that there is more than 800 billion with a B dollars laundered every year.
Oh
So
my
this
gosh.
just shy of $1 trillion a year that is caught up in these fraud cycles. So when I say it's important, like it's not like someone's getting $5, right? They're getting access to a lot of money, and some of these schemes are quite sophisticated. And I don't want to actually leave out payroll. There was a great, I have all these great stories, as you know, but there was one particular audit that was done on an overseas firm. And what they had found when they ran checks to see what banking details appeared that were the same. And
Mhm.
sure enough, there was one person receiving 74 paychecks every month or one bank account. Upon review of those 74, individuals, 73 of them no longer work there, yet all seem to still collect a paycheck. And ironically, all of them at one point in time did work for the same manager who was the lone person who was receiving all of this money. So
Wow.
it does happen in payroll. This is a very unique event, and it didn't happen in a Canadian or a US market type place where I think there's probably a little bit more oversight from a government agency on those types of
Right.
things, but it does happen. So like we're talking about significant sums.
Wow. Like I was just thinking about those, 74, and it's interesting that you had mentioned that it's not in Canada or the US, because I feel like in Canada, like if you don't submit your, I mean, even in the USA, if you don't submit a tax return, somebody's gonna know real quick
They get
that,
excited, right?
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so I feel like that sort of scheme wouldn't necessarily last for very long.
It'd be very short-lived. You could do
Hmm.
that. You could do that until somebody has to file their taxes, and then it would be
Exactly.
pretty tough. But we do have other problems within sort of the Canada US market space. Those can be just straight up fraudulent invoices that are sent in. There was a one recently where Google and somebody, I think Apple, received very large invoices for tens of millions of dollars, and the person had duplicated or replicated a company that they did do a lot of business with, and so they made off with in excess of $100 million in fraudulent money. They were caught by the FBI eventually, and I think they probably took their money away, but it does happen, right? And that's just external, right? So you have external influencers trying to get money out of the system, trying to you know, see what they can get away with. Then you have internal problems, right? So these are individuals that might be disgruntled in their role or have other problems, and so they're you know, actively within the system steering funds. And one of those can look like you know, an individual, you know, knowing that there's a big cash call for a big, maybe it's, you know, 9, 10, $12 million check or wire. And they go in, and right before that release is going through, they, you know, happen to have, you know, master data credentials, and they go in and they edit the wire details. And 3 days later, they have $10 million in their bank account in
Oh my
another country.
gosh.
They bought a plane ticket, and then by the time everyone figures out where it is, that wire's moved through 3 different other banks in 5 different countries, and it's been cashed.
That's crazy. That's
Yeah.
crazy.
So I
That
have a
is
lot
like
of fun
movie
stories.
material.
They are. A lot of them do get made into movies. It's sad though, because a lot of them get caught, right? Because if you're stealing that much money, there's a lot of people that are looking for it.
Mm,
So you know, you do have to sort of wonder about what people maybe are thinking when they're stealing those kinds of money, because you know, generally it's somebody else wants it just as bad as how much you took it or wanted to take it. So
yeah.
um
Yeah.
yeah,
Crazy. So you're sorry, I had cut you off when you said I have all sorts of fun stories.
I do. How many more stories would you like?
I don't know. I think that we were going to talk about, and I don't know whether or not you still want to, if you're still up for this discussion, but a number of, I want to say 1 or 2 years ago, or maybe it was last year,
Yeah.
um, there was and this doesn't necessarily have to do with fraud. And so like,
No.
okay, so let's just finish tie this fraud conversation up with a bow, in that obviously, you know, there's two ways to the ways to get money out of of your company need to be shored up with very solid controls, right? And so,
Yep.
like, just to finish off this, like, what would you recommend to an organization to shore up and make sure that nobody can, you know, pretend to be other employees who have either died or left the company and still receive a paycheck, and then also like do like cash calls or like change up wire details
Mhm.
as you had mentioned. What are those controls that we should be looking out for or putting into our organizations?
And once again, Kat, fantastic question. So basically, it's an umbrella program called governance. And under the governance, you have three key areas. You have your people, your processes, and your system. And your governance has to, you know, when it comes to people, are they adequately trained? Do you have, you know, backup, you know, for people in critical, you know, spaces and areas? Are they required to take a mandated, you know, 2 or 3 week vacation a year, and somebody else actually has to take on that role and
Mm,
do that job? That's where you find a lot. When you get into systems, what are your system, you know, governance reports? You know, where do you pull things? You know, what are some key stop levels or things that require maybe like an additional approval or additional validation check?
right.
And then your processes. So your processes are like how the money flows, you know, who initiates a request, who approves a request, and it's that entire process through your system. Those three things all need to be aligned. They all need to have a governance program that attaches to them, that is reviewed at a minimum annually, and
Mm,
has an escalation protocol within it. So if somebody's like, this isn't right, they don't just ignore it or move on or go back. They actually have, you know, a method and a way to escalate that so it can get the appropriate attention it deserves. Because oftentimes there's a lot of people that run into stuff that's super weird and they're like, this doesn't
yeah,
make sense, but there's nothing for them to do. There's no go do this or go do that. They say
right.
something to someone and they're like, I don't even understand what you're talking about, let alone how I would go and investigate that. And that's where you really see a lot of more technical and sophisticated fraud programs, because they're into the nuance of something that's quite technical, that not everyone can understand easily, and it requires maybe a sophisticated auditor or another type of subject matter expert to come in and actually unpack what's happening to
Right.
identify the fraud program.
Right. So let's actually just like, so this is these individuals who specialize in fraud. They're different from your regular, you know, big four external auditors, right?
They are. So these are very much specialty people within their
Mhm.
space. They often have custom algorithms that they use to
Oh,
glean data out of the system. They, have experience testifying. They, have led, very large fraud programs, either at institutions or very large organizations. So they are. I call them a purple squirrel. Like they're just very special. Like sometimes they're unicorns, right? Like they're just really, really unique and quite special.
or sorry, niched. Why can't I say that word? It's
I've
it's a
heard that word's a hard
specialty.
one. It's a specialty. Yeah, I've heard niche. It's
Or
their
niche.
niche, and then or their niche, and it just
That's
depends
kind of
on
what it
what
is.
part of the country or.
Exactly. Yeah, like this, exactly. Right. Okay, so fraud. Uh, um, Now going back to one of our previous conversations, we had either, and I can't remember whether or not this was on air or you and I were simply discussing this amongst ourselves, but there was an incident, and we're not going to name the company, in North America that had suffered a very vicious uh, penetration
Yep.
from, and it's not necessarily fraud per se, more so than it
No.
was, I think it's like cyber security.
Yes, you're 100% bang on. So it was a major cyber incident in which they lost their cloud environment, which was both their operating as well as their business systems. Operating systems, of course, are extremely important because if they go down, they can cause actual failure within, say, a utility or industrial application, which can cause, of course, damage, fatalities, you name it. And then you've got your business processes and programs, which is, payroll, your ERP system, like you name it. Like it's the other pieces. So yeah, they lost control of both their operating and their business systems.
Crazy. So how did it happen?
So my understanding is that they had a serious infiltration where the perpetrator mimicked a large number of people within the executive committee and
Oh,
got access to the cloud and got access to the keychain within the cloud.
okay, hold
Once
on.
they had,
So, just to level set,
sure.
can you explain what we mean by cloud?
Okay,
Like in
great,
this,
great
and
question
how
again.
does somebody get keys into the cloud?
So that's a great question. So the cloud is like a Microsoft Azure environment. So
Mm.
that's a really good example. So it's a big, huge online repository where all your
Mm.
stuff organizationally lives. So you think it's kind of like an offsite library. So instead of having servers in your basement, they all live in the cloud. They all live externally with your provider. And as an example, like Microsoft Azure would be a cloud provider type of environment, just to make it
Gotcha.
really simple.
Or like
Um,
Amazon Web Services, that's another
at
one, right?
ASW,
Mm.
yep, there's a bunch out there. You would have a better understanding of all the different providers. So a keychain is like an elaborate password,
Mm.
and a keychain in a cloud environment or any other sort of IT stack environment gives the holder of the keychain access to do things, to
Mm.
change passwords, to um, change all sorts of stuff, go in and review things, look at stuff. And so that becomes really problematic if somebody it'd be the same as somebody had the keys to your house and they're wandering
Mm.
through your house.
Yep.
And you can't lock them out because they have the key. In fact,
Right.
you're locked out because you no longer have your keys.
Right.
Right? So it becomes problematic in that, you lose control. And in these big cyber attacks and cyber breaches, it becomes a really big concern when, especially if you're an operating company and you operate, say, like a utility, like
Mm,
electricity, right? Or you operate, something else that has a physical asset
right.
that can be disrupted. And so those are the things that we take very seriously, because we need to make sure that the people who run them keep control of them.
Right, 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 right. And I remember, and I do have a friend who actually works for this particular organization. And at the time, we were at his house when it happened. He's like, he literally couldn't even so much as use his company. He had to shut down his laptop.
Mm-hmm.
He couldn't even use his company issued phone, not for anything, not for text messages, not for, certainly not for emails, not for calls,
Yep.
nothing. It was completely offline. And I remember when he was telling us this, I'm like, oh my God, what about your finance department? Like, how are they going to
Yep.
proceed and close out the month and do all of that? So, like, I think that, and in my head, I was kind of imagining that, well, in order to process further, they would have had to go back to like paper files, secure within a physical location, right? With probably brand new computers and
Yep.
just secured within that little room or whatever, that series of rooms, and complete all of that. That's crazy.
Yeah, so they would have engaged their emergency response plan, right? So, which likely now has been updated to include some additional items, but
Right.
100%. So the algorithm that, once the person got access to the cloud, they just pushed down um, spyware, we'll just call it ransomware,
Mm,
that just then permeated through all the connected devices because we're all connected, which
right.
meant that it could duplicate or replicate anybody within the system. So if it got onto your phone and you're using your phone and you're texting your mom and your brother, it's going to collect all that data. And whoever the perpetrator is just going to pull that data from your phone, and then they're going to get all this data.
That's right.
I don't know how much, because I have no idea how much data they did get. I do know that they got a subsection of data, that they threatened the organization with, that was basically a list of customers,
Mm,
and customer phone numbers, but none of there was no banking information or credit card information or anything else. And the organization just was like, cool, you found our stuff. And so then they went to the public and said, yeah, they have all this stuff, give us a call, like, here's if you have a problem, here's what you call. So they kind of called them out on
oh,
all their extortion attempts, I guess we'll say.
that's
And
awesome.
then ultimately decided just to rebuild their environments. Of course, with help of their trusted service providers, but not giving in, not paying, and just rebuilding it, was extremely expensive. But ultimately, I think was probably a much better plan of action. But it does, when we talk about sort of the governance and like people, processes, and systems, someone, impersonating somebody in your C-suite's really quite easy now with AI, with
Yeah, oh,
you know
yeah.
emails, like all the stuff. So finding ways to make sure that if you have something that's that critical, that you have additional measures put in place where somebody can't just come in and do that. Like you actually have to, make a series of like external phone calls. Like you're not clicking on links. You're not, you're actually moving outside and following a different, almost paper process.
Hmm.
Um, so that people can't do that. You have to require the authentication programs and codes, right? If someone says, "Oh, I don't have my authentication whatever app with me," I'll just reset it anyway. Sorry, no can do, right? Like
Yeah,
those authentication protocols are there for a reason,
right.
and just because somebody's potentially maybe in the C-suite doesn't mean that they really are. And if they are in the C-suite, they should, make sure that they always provide those additional credentials, because that's, a very effective way from a first line defense of trying to stop these types of cybersecurity threats.
Right, right. So interestingly enough, we've been talking about like large organizations, but I mean, it doesn't actually matter. And I dare say that the size of your organization, like the larger your organization is, yeah, the more vulnerable points you have, but also the more importance and the more effort they would be putting in to shoring up all of these gaps. Where I would surmise is for smaller organizations, like small to medium-sized business, they're probably thinking like, oh, it's just a small, like I have a small company, nobody's going to care about me. But I feel like those are really easy targets because they're
Fair.
going to have smaller budgets. If they don't have the know-how to like they don't know what best practices are. They probably don't even much care about cybersecurity, or they'll outsource it to not sure who, like had so what are some things that like small or medium-sized business, probably is like smaller businesses, because medium-sized business, I feel like they would probably have a better handle on it, but like, the one or two, like it's the sole proprietor, maybe like one or two 5 to 10 employees type thing. What can they do? Because they probably don't have the budget to like be this crazy, put in this Fort Knox situation, right? What are some easy things that they can do?
Well, that's a really good question, Kat. So the first thing if you are running a business, any business, you need to make sure that you have appropriate insurance protocols,
Mhm.
and there is cybersecurity insurance. And so it doesn't, if you are a one person show, you can get it. If you are 10 people, you can get it. And that basically enables you access to support if you do come under a cyber attack.
Okay.
Um, they also will help you, like maybe you need to replace your computers. Maybe you need to like, there's a specific thing that need to be done. There'd be insurance provisions for that. But the single best thing about making sure that you have a robust cybersecurity program is that when something happens, you pick up the phone, you call your insurer, and they have specialty purple squirrels. No, just kidding. They have specialty people within that space that can come in and help like identify who the perpetrator is, help you get your stuff back, mitigate any losses, like all that kind of stuff. And so oftentimes we get embarrassed when things happen.
Yeah, yeah, of course.
A lot of people would be like, oh, how could I be so stupid? I didn't do a thing with a thing and I clicked on the bad link and now I've lost all my, all my stuff. And instead of being embarrassed, going to for help and saying to our insurance provider, I don't like I clicked on the wrong thing. I need help. I thought it was legitimately from my bank. And they're like, okay, well, like let's next steps. And then they'll come in and they'll really help you manage through it. And the unfortunate part is that a lot of people do pay,
Mm.
and that's why
Oh,
they do pay. A lot of individuals do pay the ransomware to get their family photos back or to get their whatever it is back, and it's not great because that then continues to fuel this economy
yes,
of fraud.
exactly.
But a lot of people just feel that they're helpless and they can't do it. So it's really important. One of the things I like to do is I try to back up my stuff
Mhm.
on a device, right? So I might have like a time machine. Some other people might have an external hard drive, right? And so occasionally you just go and you back up your stuff, maybe every Friday.
Mhm.
You back up your stuff. And so if something happens, well, you might lose 2 days worth of stuff.
Right.
But you're not losing everything. And I think that that's um, a really important thing to do, regardless of the size of your organization, whether you're mom and pop, you're 10 people, 500 people, 10,000 people, making sure you have appropriate backups. And those backups are secure, offsite, and then sometimes even having a physical backup. So that's one of the things that we're seeing now is people will host everything on their cloud, and then they'll have
Hmm.
a physical server backup that runs every Friday.
Is that necessary? Like if you have, and again, I guess this all point circles back to the cloud conversation because like as a small business person, I would be inclined that, oh, hey, like we've got a cloud situation. They're gonna handle it. Is that a safe thing to do? Or like do you know like because the thing is that how would you even back up something offline if you are in the cloud? You don't really have a whole lot of control over that, do you?
That's a really good question. I don't actually have an answer for you on that. So for me, I have a lot of my stuff in like iCloud, right? Like it just lives
Yeah,
off my Apple
yeah,
device, right? But then I also download it to an external device. The key stuff, like the stuff that
right.
you know, I'm not, backing up my browser history, but I am backing up my photos and maybe some key documents and stuff like that. And I think that's for me, that's really important. When I think about the number of cybersecurity breaches that are happening with like significant amount of data being impacted, having a separate physically secure backup that is separate and apart from your cloud environment allows you to rebuild in the event that you are hacked quite
Right.
quickly. Um, Regardless of whether or not you can like undo the hackers hacking, which doesn't seem to be likely right now. Like when I look at all of the case studies and all of the examples, like the one we just talked about, undoing without paying, undoing, their involvement, and then once they're in, how do you get them out? Right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
like so once they get in and they get in and they have the cloud and they have all the stuff, and then they're like, okay, yeah, peace out, we're leaving now. Are they really gone? Or did they
No.
build themselves a
Yeah.
back door to come back in,
Right.
right?
Yeah,
And so
exactly.
if you've got to rebuild it, you want to make sure that you're doing it from a point in time that's prior to anyone having access to your data.
Oh, that's clever. I never even thought about that. And you're absolutely right. Yeah, like bring it back. Essentially, you're essentially going back in time before, all of this happened. I feel like if you are engaging a cloud provider, at least know to ask this question is that what is your strategy? Like you need to be asking and understanding fully what your outsourced cloud provider's strategy is for cybersecurity attacks, and then what is their backup? Like, how do you, what, if we had to go to a backup, what does that disaster recovery protocol look like? Right?
And yeah, and so the disaster recovery or emergency response really needs to include your cyber program, right? So um, most people are just thinking of like fire, flood, other types of major events, um, in terms of their emergency response. Emergency response now needs to include, things like, violence, cybersecurity, and other when you can't physically access your environments anymore. And in terms of doing that, you need to set up a robust team or, a committee that makes sure that, all the information that you need to do your job or to carry on or to pay people, that you have some sort of, magic. We used to have a magic binder back in my day. We'd have like a couple of years ago, we'd have a, emergency response binder that you actually
Mm.
would go and it would have a purchase order and it would have like an expense form and everything else that we would normally just use in the system, and it would have printout versions of different things so that you could physically continue to do your job.
Oh my God,
um,
that's a brilliant suggestion. That's a brilliant idea. Like have
and it,
copies of these. Yeah.
we've always moved obviously away from paper, but when all of a sudden everything's shut down and you have no access to a computer, you can't use your company
Yeah.
cell phone, everything else, how do you do it?
Yeah, exactly. Via paper. And
So, we would create paper binders for just for that purpose. Now, I'm sure, there's, maybe other tools and things like that, but it's also why for me having, an external, safe space for critical data is also important, because if your backup's also in the cloud and your backup's connected to your parent arrangement and there's an interface there, there's the ability for a hacker to get through and get all the way from your current data into your backup data, right? So if there isn't a
mm,
segregation there, there's always that opportunity that all is going to get commingled and then you lose both sets of data.
that's
And
right.
you're like, well,
That's
but
right.
I had this great backup plan. Well, it
Yeah.
doesn't exist anymore.
Yeah, yeah. So sorry, just to clarify. So Stephanie had mentioned the concept of an interface between your current system and your backup system. And really what that is, and you can correct me if I've misrepresented this, but really what that is you have to have some sort of channel in which to move your data from your live system, your live operating system into that backup system.
Mhm.
And that's really all she's referring to. Like that interface is really the road between our live system data and our backup
Yeah.
area. Mhm.
And if that connection is just like your USB cable to an external my case, right? Like external hard drive, right? You
Mhm.
unplug it, it's no longer connected. If it lives within a cloud-based environment and that connection remains all the time,
Yeah.
then you have a potential for impact. But if they live in two different environments and there's no interchange, you got like they come down and connect separately, and you'd have to talk to a data security expert. I am not a data security expert, but I'm sure there are different ways with more sophisticated technologies today. But with what we've seen recently, the sheer volume of attacks and the
Mhm.
amount of data that's being taken over, I think that it's really important to take a solid look at that and make sure that you have a really good example. The one company that we were speaking to with their operating assets, they physically unplugged operating assets. There was no mechanism in between the cloud and the operating assets. It was a direct one-to-one. So the perpetrator could go directly to the operating asset and turn it off, turn it up higher, which could potentially cause a major impact. And so they had to physically unplug operating assets and like disconnect the cables so that they couldn't access those operating assets. So I know it probably sounds a little kind of like a movie, but we need to make sure that we have the ability to shut off and control those different pockets
How
between
do you
operating.
how do you even do that? Look, so um often organizations, and this organization that you're referring to would be no different, but they have SCADA systems in which they govern, these systems, and I can't remember what SCADA actually stands for, but they have these computer systems that would govern like major pieces of equipment to say, for example, dig a hole or like do some sort of drilling in and I mean, we're in Alberta, right? And so like we have a lot of drilling that happens here in oil wells and all of that. And so they have computer systems that manage all of this and keep tabs of what's going on. And so how do you even go about like unplugging everything? It's not like you can just like unplug a computer from a wall.
Yeah, so
Or
you
maybe it
have what's
is.
called an emergency shutdown. So SCADA, so for pipeline data, right, and the operation and pressure components of your pipeline within your data sets is what would control how much pressure or flow and different things like that, and then your SCADA is going to report on it. Um, so at least I think that's how I remember it. We might
Hmm.
have to Google
Hmm.
SCADA before we release this and make sure this is on point. Um,
I think you're right.
I think but so basically, in a nutshell, if there isn't a secondary layer of authentication between your cloud operating system and your individual operating asset, if there isn't a barrier here, an authentication barrier
Hmm.
they need to log in again to get through. If that isn't there and it's a direct straight through to connect to your operating system,
Yeah.
then you are unplugging and you engage your emergency shutdown protocols and you turn it off.
Right.
Because that's otherwise you're not in control of your asset. Um, and then future forward, you want to make sure that you have additional authentication protocols that aren't a one-click log on, that protect you from the cloud gaining access into your operational assets should it become corrupted. So
Yeah.
those barriers and those layers are an essential piece of takeaway for anyone who has an operational asset that's connected to their cloud.
Yeah, 100%. Like you just even, I mean, it's a balance between efficiency, oh, it's annoying for me to have to log in every time and put my password in every time. So, I mean, you can strike a balance between, your password can can last for about like 1 or 2 days, and then you'd have to re-log in or something like that. Like whatever would make sense to your, I guess, your organization, right?
Yeah, or you're using authentication codes, right? So you'd use your Microsoft Authenticator or RAS or any of those other authentication programs so that every time you log on, even if it's a single sign-on, you have to authenticate your sign-on and you're the only one that has the device. So, that there are other ways to do that. I think that are not super cumbersome or constantly changing your password. But, it's really important, and even if you're an individual, it's a small organization like you talked about earlier, maybe you got 5 people, but maybe you have client data that you're working through to do a report on and things like that. Making sure that that data is in a secure place, making sure that it requires some sort of password to access. If somebody gets access to your computer or somebody your employee's computer, they can't just go in and get it all. There is an authentication process for where you keep your key data and things like that. And I don't think that's too hard to set up. Even on the most basic computers, you can set up, folders or restricted areas that require passwords.
Right.
And it might not defeat every cyber secure or cyber hacker person out there, but it's gonna stop some, right? And so just having that extra layer in there, I think, is really helpful.
And also educating whoever's involved, right? Like educating your so your team members for what to look for. Like, for example, like even something as simple as phishing emails and like
Mm,
recognizing, because there's a lot of scammy emails and they're so good, they're so well done that like
yeah,
even me, I'm like, is this for real? Or like, is this what? This is really
I got
well done.
it's funny that you say that. I got one from my bank the other day, and I was like, "What is this?" And I clicked on it, and then it went blank, and I was like,
Oh crap.
"This." And the attachment's not working. And then the person's like, "Oh, check this link." And then I hovered over it and I got a little warning thing that came up from Google Chrome actually. And it said, "This is suspicious. Please proceed with caution." So I forwarded it to the bank and I said, "Hey, is this you guys?" And they're like, "Please don't
Nope.
open this."
Please don't.
And they're like, "Thank you for sending it to us." But I was thinking, "Oh, I gotta do my thing." I got the bank sending
Yeah.
me a note, and it was totally bogus. And so it wasn't until I really like dug into the email, and it was very sophisticated. The email identification came up as um, a bank email, right? You had to actually click on it to see the actual, the details of the details
Actual
to see
right.
what the right. But when you first look at it, it's Bob Smith from your bank, and then the header was exactly the bank's header with all the graphics. The signature line was to their standard. Like it was a perfect bank email, with the one
Wow.
exception is it wasn't from the bank.
Right. And the only way you could have, so again, if you're listening to this and you don't know how to, like you're thinking about, oh, how do I identify something that is truly from the bank? What you can always do is go into, like, just click on the email address that the got like the from email address. And if it's not, so for example, like rbc.com is Royal Bank of Canada, but if it's like rbc.mailtrap.blackhole.com. That is 100% not RBC. Don't click on
Yeah,
that, right?
yeah.
And so what I often do is if I get an email that I was like, I can't really determine whether or not this is legit or not, I'll actually go on another computer or like something else and actually Google the bank and use my own link. Like I won't actually go ahead and click on the link that was provided to me. Because especially if you have, so say like for banks, especially, um, there you can just like go onto a neutral, like just go ahead and Google that bank, you know, and click on the link that you found. And of course you have to make sure that it is also legit, but it's easier to do that than to actually just like go ahead and trust the link on the email, right?
Yeah, I
So
trust no email links these days, none.
yeah, I hear you. I hear you. Unless they're like, no, yeah, no, I mean, unless they're like truly like a what your colleague is sending you. But even so, like you have to discern that, right?
I think
Yeah.
you need to be really, really careful these days, and even trying to like if you sent me a link to a government website, I might just go and Google that government website
Yeah.
on my own, and just because it's easy enough to find. Um, just because it's really hard, and you have no idea who's intercepting or pretending, or somebody's going to pretend to be you, and like it's really hard. It's
Yeah.
really hard. So just abundance of caution, and don't trust any links.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Exactly. And the thing is that so there's a lot of little micro courses out there that you can educate, you can send your team to that they're free and like even like a YouTube, there are
Hmm.
tons of YouTube videos on how to detect like what is fraud, like what a fraudulent email is, what's a phishing email. And a lot of that is just like education, right? And so like if your team members and your employees know what to look for and know what to do on like what looks suspicious and what is legit, then you're that much far ahead that than somebody that than had you not done this, right?
100%. 100%. You're bang on.
You can't
Yep.
actually always just rely on system controls. Like as you say, Stephanie,
Yep.
like it's a combination between process, people as in the know-how, right? And system.
Yep. 100%.
Excellent. Well, this has been an illuminating conversation as per usual.
I always
Any
love chatting with you. It's so good.
right? As do I. As do I. And so, do you have what are some final and I feel like we kind of touched on this, but um for our audience, like if you're listening to this, what are some quick things that you can implement tomorrow in your organization to protect you from all the things that we've been talking about today?
Oh, oof, that's a tough. So for key takeaways, I think, one of the things is making sure that you have, a governance model in place. That governance model talks to your people, talks to your processes, and talks to your systems. And so in each of those spaces and places, in an appropriate manner for your type of business, you're making sure that, one person doesn't have all the keys to the kingdom, making sure that you have, multiple, checks and balances, maybe, some audits, periodic audits, making sure that your system is, robust enough and has sufficient passwords and authentication protocols and barriers between programs so that, one thing can't creep into another. And then just making sure that, as you're reviewing your processes and your systems, that they make sense for the business. The business isn't trying to like constantly go around something because it doesn't work for your business, that they're efficient, that there's clear rules, delegations of authority and guidelines within those. And I think that's probably a good place to start. And those are all things that you can implement tomorrow.
Excellent.
Thanks, Kat.